A British general hid inside his tent to avoid the shame of surrender. Thousands of red-coated soldiers marched in silence toward an open field. An American army stood waiting with muskets leveled and eyes fixed on the horizon. The most powerful empire on earth had just lost its grip on the colonies. A single sword lay on the ground, representing the end of a global conflict. The world had truly turned upside down in a remote Virginia town. General George Washington received urgent news on August 14, 1781. A letter confirmed that Admiral François Joseph Paul de Grasse was sailing north. The French fleet carried 28 ships of the line and 3,000 soldiers. Washington abandoned his long-held plan to attack the British in New York City. He pivoted his entire Continental Army toward the south. The target was the Chesapeake Bay. Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis occupied the town of Yorktown. He commanded the British forces in the southern department. His troops occupied a narrow peninsula between the York and James rivers. He expected the Royal Navy to arrive at any moment with reinforcements. He did not know that his maritime escape route was already closing. Admiral de Grasse arrived in the Chesapeake Bay on August 30, 1781. His massive fleet dropped anchor across the mouth of the York River. The French warships formed a wall of timber and iron. Cornwallis watched from the shore as his supply lines vanished. The British Army was now completely isolated on the peninsula. Rear Admiral Thomas Graves led a British fleet from New York to break the blockade. He spotted the French sails near the entrance of the bay on September 5, 1781. The Battle of the Capes began with the thunder of broadside cannons. Smoke obscured the horizon as the two navies traded heavy fire. The French fleet held its position with disciplined maneuvering. Graves realized his ships were outmatched in the narrow waters. The British admiral signaled a retreat back toward the safety of New York. His sails vanished into the northern mist by the end of the day. Cornwallis remained trapped within the earthworks of Yorktown. No reinforcements would arrive to save his 7,000 men. The French Navy controlled the sea and the fate of the rebellion. Washington closed the distance as the maritime trap snapped shut. The Allied army arrived outside Yorktown on September 28, 1781. General George Washington rode at the head of the column. Beside him rode the Comte de Rochambeau. The combined force numbered roughly 16,600 men. Columns of American infantry stretched for miles along the dusty roads. French regiments marched in precise, disciplined formations behind them. The American contingent included approximately 8,800 soldiers. The French expeditionary force contributed 7,800 seasoned troops. They converged on the narrow peninsula between the York and James rivers. The landscape consisted of thick forests and flat, marshy terrain. Yorktown sat on a high bluff overlooking the river. British earthworks formed a jagged line along the town's perimeter. Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis watched from the fortifications. His 7,000 troops scanned the horizon for sails from New York. No British ships appeared on the empty river. The French naval blockade remained anchored firmly in the bay. Cornwallis realized his maritime escape route was permanently severed. Allied engineers began scouting the ground for siege lines. The soldiers broke ground with iron shovels and heavy picks. They dug deep trenches through the hard Virginia soil. The earthworks mirrored the curve of the British defensive perimeter. Washington and Rochambeau surveyed the enemy positions from horseback. They marked the distance to the British redoubts with brass instruments. The Allied camps expanded across the field surrounding the town. White tents dotted the landscape like a sprawling temporary city. The soldiers hauled heavy siege cannons into position overnight. Oxen pulled the massive guns through the deep, rutted mud. The air grew heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine. The British soldiers watched the trenches creep closer each day. They lacked the numbers to launch a significant counterattack. Cornwallis remained trapped within his narrowing circle of defenses. The Allied army tightened its grip on the peninsula. The reality of the siege settled over the British garrison. The strategic hurdle shifted from defense to desperate survival. The heavy bronze barrels of the French siege guns pointed toward the town. On October 9, 1781, the Allied artillery opened fire in unison. Iron cannonballs slammed into the wooden structures of Yorktown. Dust and splinters erupted as the shells tore through British fortifications. The ground shook under the rhythmic pounding of the heavy batteries. Cornwallis retreated into the inner perimeter of his defenses. The British soldiers huddled behind their crumbling earthen walls. French and American engineers surveyed the damage through brass spyglasses. They focused on two fortified positions known as Redoubt 9 and 10. These outposts projected far beyond the main British defensive line. The redoubts blocked the Allied trenches from reaching the riverbank. Washington ordered the capture of these positions to tighten the noose. The sun dipped below the horizon on the night of October 14, 1781. Alexander Hamilton gathered his light infantry in the darkness. The soldiers checked their muskets and fixed steel bayonets to the barrels. The orders were clear and carried a strict prohibition against loading weapons. The assault required total silence to achieve a surprise strike. Hamilton led his men toward the dark silhouette of Redoubt 10. The French forces moved simultaneously against Redoubt 9. They crept through the tall, damp grass of the Virginia fields. The only sound was the muffled thud of boots on soft earth. A British sentry shouted a challenge into the black night. The Allied line surged forward with a sudden, violent momentum. Hamilton's men climbed the wooden stakes of the outer palisade. They swarmed over the parapets with bayonets leveled at the defenders. The struggle inside the redoubt was brief and intensely physical. Muskets clattered against stone and earth in the cramped space. Hamilton secured the position within minutes of the initial charge. The French forces fought with equal ferocity at Redoubt 9. They cleared the trenches and neutralized the British guards. The two redoubts fell before the British could mount a defense. The Allied army immediately linked these points into their main trench line. The British defensive perimeter now sat exposed to direct cannon fire. Cornwallis watched the redoubts burn from his headquarters in the town. His soldiers lacked the strength to retake the lost ground. The Allied artillery moved forward to the newly captured positions. The guns now stood within point-blank range of the British center. The siege lines tightened around the town like a steel band. Cornwallis realized the end of his resistance had finally arrived. He stared at the empty river where no British fleet appeared. The strategic collapse of the British position was now complete. He began drafting the terms of surrender on October 17, 1781. The morning of October 19, 1781, broke over the scarred fields of Yorktown. British soldiers marched out from their shattered fortifications in silent, rigid columns. They carried their muskets with the barrels pointed toward the ground. The Allied army stood in two long, parallel lines stretching for over a mile. American troops lined the right side of the road in their worn hunting shirts. French regiments stood to the left in pristine white uniforms with polished brass buttons. The British soldiers moved through the center of this gauntlet of silent men. They reached the designated field where they prepared to stack their weapons. The Articles of Capitulation governed every movement of the defeated garrison. These terms dictated the fate of every person trapped within the town walls. Thousands of enslaved people stood watching from the edges of the British camp. Many had fled their enslavers to claim the freedom promised by the British Crown. They had trusted the words of the Philipsburg Proclamation issued years earlier. The Articles of Capitulation contained a specific clause regarding the return of property. Allied officers interpreted this clause to include the formerly enslaved people. British soldiers began the grim process of identifying these individuals for their former masters. Men, women, and children faced the immediate prospect of re-enslavement. The Allied victory at Yorktown offered no protection for these refugees. British officers followed the legal requirements of the surrender documents to the letter. They abandoned thousands of people who had sought shelter behind their lines. Some survivors attempted to hide in the marshes along the York River. Others were seized by the very men they had hoped to escape. The surrender field became a site of profound betrayal for those seeking liberty. British wagons stood loaded with supplies and equipment intended for transport. The soldiers piled their muskets into high, jagged heaps in the dirt. The contrast between the military triumph and the social reality was absolute. The liberation of the colonies did not extend to those held in bondage. Many formerly enslaved people were returned to their previous enslavers in Virginia. Others were later evacuated by the British fleet toward New York or Nova Scotia. The Articles of Capitulation ensured that the legal definition of property remained supreme. The Allied commanders focused on the orderly processing of the 7,000 British prisoners. The human cost of the surrender remained largely absent from the official reports. The soldiers finished stacking their arms and turned to face their captors. The siege of Yorktown reached its final, somber conclusion on that open field. The fate of those who sought freedom revealed the limits of the American victory. The British garrison marched into captivity as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The social order of the colony remained firmly intact despite the military defeat. The transition from war to the status of prisoners of war began immediately. The reality of the surrender treaty defined the next chapter for every person present. The morning of October 19, 1781, dawned with a heavy silence over the Virginia Peninsula. The British garrison prepared for the final act of the siege. Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis remained inside his headquarters. He claimed a sudden, debilitating illness prevented his attendance at the ceremony. He delegated the task of surrender to his deputy, Brigadier General Charles O'Hara. The British troops assembled in their tattered, dust-covered uniforms. They marched out of their fortifications with their regimental colors tightly cased. The Allied army waited in 2 long lines along the road to the surrender field. General George Washington sat atop his horse at the head of the American column. The Comte de Rochambeau stood with the French officers on the opposite side. The British column approached the Allied lines with measured, slow steps. Brigadier General Charles O'Hara rode at the front of the defeated formation. He scanned the faces of the men who had besieged his position for weeks. O'Hara halted his horse before the assembled commanders. He looked for the Continental Commander-in-Chief to receive the sword. General George Washington refused to accept the blade from a subordinate officer. He gestured toward his own second-in-command, Major General Benjamin Lincoln. Lincoln had been forced to surrender his own sword at Charleston the previous year. The symbolic weight of the exchange hung in the damp air. O'Hara presented the sword to Benjamin Lincoln in a brief mechanical gesture. The British soldiers marched into the designated field of surrender. They reached the heaps of earth where they were ordered to stack their arms. The soldiers dropped their muskets into the dirt with a rhythmic, hollow clatter. The pile of steel and wood grew into a jagged, uneven monument of defeat. A band of British musicians played a rhythmic, melancholic tune. Historical accounts later identified the melody as "The World Turned Upside Down." The song echoed across the open field as the soldiers dismantled their military identity. Other observers noted the music sounded discordant and uncertain in the afternoon heat. The ceremony lacked the pageantry of a royal military parade. It reflected the grim, exhausted reality of a campaign that had collapsed. The British soldiers stood in the field as prisoners of the Allied command. They watched the French and American officers finalize the administrative details. The surrender ceremony ended with the formal signing of the final documents. The military power of the British Southern Department vanished in a few hours. The field emptied as the prisoners were marched toward their temporary holding areas. The silence of the afternoon replaced the constant thud of heavy artillery. The war had not concluded, but the British occupation of Yorktown was over. The geopolitical landscape of the American Revolution shifted in that single, quiet day. The British surrender at Yorktown echoed across the Atlantic. London received the news with shock and disbelief. Parliamentary debates turned bitter and frantic in the winter of 1781. The political will to sustain a global war fractured under the weight of the defeat. Taxpayers grew weary of the immense cost of maintaining armies across 3 continents. Yet, the conflict persisted in the Caribbean, India, and the Mediterranean. British and French ships continued to clash over remote tropical islands. Small skirmishes flickered along the American frontier for 2 more years. Soldiers remained in their winter quarters, waiting for word of a final peace. Continental troops maintained their defensive lines in the Hudson Highlands. British garrisons held their ground in New York City and Charleston. The war did not vanish with the stacking of muskets in a Virginia field. Diplomats slowly negotiated the terms that would eventually redraw the map of the world. The Treaty of Paris was finally signed in 1783. Only then did the guns fall silent across the Atlantic theater. Yorktown had simply broken the momentum of a crumbling empire. The victory served as a catalyst for a much longer, grinding dissolution of power. You stand in the quiet aftermath of a battle that never truly ended. You believe this history is a closed book, a finished chapter of men long dead. But the cycle of shifting power and betrayal repeats, and the reach of those old, cold calculations still touches your life today. You are now standing in the very space they left behind.